The notary didn't look surprised. That was the part that stayed with me afterward. Not what she said, not even what she showed me, but the fact that she didn't look surprised at all. She set the folder down on the desk between us, folded her hands over it, and said very quietly, "There's a second will, Mr. Hargreaves. Your father signed it 11 days before he died." Around us, the office continued as normal. A phone ringing somewhere down the hall. Traffic noise from the street below. Someone's printer cycling through pages with that familiar mechanical patience. No alarms. No drama. Just that sentence, and the folder, and the notary's steady eyes. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning. My name is Lawrence Hargreaves. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years working for the city of Hamilton, Ontario. Water infrastructure, mostly. Inspections, maintenance schedules. The kind of work that keeps things running without anyone noticing until something goes wrong. I retired early. Took a pension that's enough to be comfortable if you're careful, and moved back to the house I grew up in after my wife passed away 4 years ago. It's a small place on a dead-end street in the East End. The gutters need work. The driveway heaves every spring. But it's mine, and it smells like the same wood and radiator heat it always did, and some mornings that's enough. My father, Vincent Hargreaves, was 81 when he died. A stubborn, meticulous man who had spent his working years as a bookkeeper for a chain of hardware stores that no longer exists. He balanced ledgers by hand well into the 90s, and didn't trust software he couldn't see the logic of. He kept paper records of everything. Utility bills going back 2 decades, receipts for appliances he'd replaced 3 times over, a calendar on the kitchen wall with every appointment written in the same precise capitals he'd used his entire life. He lived alone after my mother died. Said he didn't need help. Said the house was manageable, and for a while it was. My daughter moved back to Ontario about 6 years ago with her husband. They'd been out west for a few years, Vancouver, chasing work in real estate development. When they came back, they settled in Oakville, maybe 40 minutes from Dad's place. My son-in-law has always had an eye for what things are worth. He'd walk into a room and you could almost see him calculating. Not in a cruel way, exactly. Just in a way that made you feel like everything around him was an asset or a liability, and he was still deciding which category you fell into. They started visiting Dad more regularly after my wife died. I appreciated it at the time. Dad was getting older, I was grieving, and the idea that someone was checking in on him made it easier to breathe. My daughter brought groceries. Her husband helped with the odd repair. They took Dad to his appointments when his license was pulled after the eye test. I didn't question it. I should have, but I didn't. Dad died on a Tuesday in February. The kind of February day Hamilton does especially well. Gray from horizon to horizon. Wind off the lake that cuts right through you no matter how you're dressed. The hospice called at 6 in the morning. By the time I got there, he was already gone. Peaceful, they said. He'd been sleeping. The week after the funeral is mostly a blur. People came. Food appeared. My daughter was organized about it, the way she tends to be. Thank you cards drafted, reception handled, flower arrangements returned. Her husband made a point of mentioning, more than once, that they should probably sit down soon to discuss the estate. No rush, he'd say, in a tone that suggested there was absolutely a rush. Just whenever you're ready. I nodded and said, of course, and didn't think much of it. Dad's lawyer was a man named William Chow, who'd handled his affairs for nearly 20 years. Quiet, precise, the kind of lawyer who uses 2 words when one would do, and never uses one when silence will work better. He called me a week after the funeral and asked if I could come in. I assumed it was routine. In the car on the way there, my daughter called. She and her husband wanted to come to the meeting, she said, just to be supportive, just to help me navigate things. I said I'd let her know how it went. There was a pause. Dad, she said carefully, we've actually already been in touch with Mr. Chow's office. We thought it might be easier if we were all there together. I kept my eyes on the road. When were you in touch with him? Just last week. After the funeral. We wanted to make sure everything was coordinated. I said that was fine. We hung up. My hands were steady on the wheel, but something in my chest wasn't. They were already in the parking lot when I arrived. My son-in-law had a coffee for me, extended with a smile, the practiced warmth of a man who is good at reading rooms and adjusting accordingly. We went in together. William Chow met us in the small conference room. He greeted me first, then acknowledged my daughter and her husband with the kind of neutral professionalism that gives nothing away. He had a folder in front of him. He opened it, looked at the top page for a moment, then looked at me. "Lawrence," he said, "before we begin, I want to ask you something directly. Were you aware that your father came to see me in November? I wasn't. Were you aware that he revised his will at that time?" My daughter shifted in her seat. Her husband's smile held, but something behind his eyes went very still. "No," I said. "I wasn't aware of that." William nodded slowly. "Then I think we need to go through this carefully." I excused myself from the office to make a phone call that didn't need to happen. In the hallway, I stood next to a window that looked out onto the parking lot and the gray February sky and tried to think. My father had changed his will 3 months before he died. He hadn't mentioned it to me. He hadn't mentioned it to my daughter or her husband either, clearly, because the way she'd shifted in that chair was not the movement of someone who already knew. My father wasn't a dramatic man. He didn't revise things on impulse. He didn't make changes to important documents without a reason. If he'd gone to see William Chow in November, it was because something had happened that required a correction. I went back into the room. The revised will was straightforward in its structure. What was not straightforward was what it replaced. William laid out both documents side by side. The original will, dated 4 years earlier, left the house and the majority of the estate, including a registered retirement savings account that I hadn't known the balance of, to be divided equally among 3 parties: me, my daughter, and a small bequest to a cousin in New Brunswick. Standard enough. Not surprising. The revised will removed my daughter entirely. Her name was gone. The bequest to the cousin remained. Everything else came to me. My daughter said very quietly, "There must be a mistake." William said equally quietly, "There's no mistake." Her husband cleared his throat. "Mr. Chow, with respect, my father-in-law was in declining health in November. His cognitive state was assessed," William said, cutting him off without raising his voice. "At my request, before I would proceed, I have documentation from his family physician. Your grandfather was of sound mind." The room went very still. There was more in the folder. William had clearly expected this meeting to go the way it was going, because he'd prepared for it. He walked me through what he'd learned from my father over 3 meetings in October and November of last year. My daughter and her husband had held power of attorney for my father's personal care since 2020. He'd signed it willingly, he'd told William. He trusted his granddaughter. She'd been helpful. He thought it was a sensible arrangement. What he hadn't understood, not at first, was that a separate document, one he remembered signing but couldn't fully recall, had extended that authority to include his finances. He noticed the discrepancies in 2022. Small ones at first. An RRSP withdrawal he didn't remember authorizing. A bill he'd already paid being paid again from a different account. He'd asked my daughter about it. She'd told him he was confused, that he'd forgotten, that she was handling things so he wouldn't have to worry. He'd believed her. He was 80 years old, his eyesight was failing, and the woman sitting across from him at his own kitchen table was his granddaughter. Why wouldn't he believe her? But he kept records. That was the thing about my father. He always kept records. And slowly, over the following year, a pattern emerged in his own handwriting. Withdrawals he hadn't authorized. Transfers to an account he didn't recognize. Charges routed through something called Pemberton Advisory Group, which, as far as William's research could determine, had no web presence, no registered address, and shared a phone number with my son-in-law's personal cell. He came to William in October. He brought the records in a manila envelope. He was frightened, he said, but he was not confused. William had encouraged him to contact the police. He had, once. The officer who took his call suggested it might be a misunderstanding and recommended he speak with the family first. When he mentioned this to my daughter, she told him she'd look into it. He never heard anything more. He decided instead to do what he could with the time he had. He revised the will. He gave William detailed instructions about when and how to present it. And he wrote me a letter, which William slid across the table toward me now. Sealed, my name in my father's blocky handwriting on the front. I didn't open it in the room. I don't know why. Maybe because whatever was inside felt too private for an audience. My daughter asked to see a copy of the revised will. William provided one. She and her husband left the office before I did. On the way out, her husband put his hand briefly on my arm and said, "Lawrence, no one wants this to become something adversarial. I'm sure we can find a way to work through it together." I looked at his hand on my arm. I didn't say anything. When they were gone, I sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes. William refilled my coffee without being asked and left me to it. The drive back took longer than usual, not because of traffic. I just drove slowly. I parked outside the house for a while before going in. That evening, I opened the letter. It was 2 pages, handwritten, the letters more uneven than they used to be, but still unmistakably his. "Lawrence, if you're reading this, then William did as I asked, and things are moving the way they need to move. I'm sorry I didn't talk to you sooner. I want you to understand why I didn't. I was ashamed. Not of them, of myself. For not seeing it. For signing things without reading them closely enough. For believing that people who said they loved me meant it the way I thought they did. I spent my whole working life catching other people's errors in columns of numbers. I should have caught this. I didn't, not until it was already done. I also didn't want to put you in the position of having to choose sides between me and your daughter. I know what she means to you. I didn't want to take that from you before I knew for certain. But I do know for certain now. The records don't lie. I want you to know something else. I'm not angry. Disappointed, yes. Frightened, yes, for a while. But not angry. Anger is expensive at my age, and I'd rather leave you something more useful. What I want you to do is let this go through properly. Let the lawyers handle it. Let the process do what it's supposed to do. Don't confront anyone. Don't argue. Let the paperwork speak. I kept everything. It's all with William. And Lawrence, I know how much you've been carrying since Joan died. I know you've tried to keep the peace with everyone because that's who you are. But peace built on letting things go unaddressed isn't peace. It's just postponed trouble. You were always the careful one. You check things twice. That used to drive me crazy when you were young. I'm grateful for it now. I love you, son. Take good care of the house. Daddy read it twice. Then I sat in the kitchen for a long time without doing anything. The next morning, my daughter called. Her voice was composed, professional, the tone she uses when she's decided how something is going to go. She said she wanted to meet for coffee, just the two of them, without her husband. She said she thought there might be some confusion about certain documents. She said she wanted to make sure we were on the same page before things got complicated. I told her I was going to let William handle the estate. A long pause. Dad, I think if we talk about this, we can. I'm going to let William handle it, I said again. That's what Dad wanted. She said she'd call later in the week. She didn't. But her husband did. He was friendly on the phone, measured, reasonable. He talked about the difficulty of estate processes, the way families can misread intentions, the importance of keeping things civil. He mentioned twice that they had put in considerable time over the past few years helping my father. Time that had real value, time that hadn't been compensated. He used the phrase equitable recognition without apparent irony. I told him I'd pass his thoughts along to William. That evening I started writing things down. Not because anyone told me to, just because it seemed like the right thing to do. Dates, exact phrases, the tone of voice, anything that might matter later. William called 3 weeks later. "There's an investigator involved now," he said. "Your father's file was referred to the Ontario Securities Commission and the Hamilton Police Service Financial Crimes Unit. The name on the Pemberton advisory account, it matches a numbered company registered in your son-in-law's name in 2019. I sat down. "How much?" I asked. "Altogether, across 3 years, approximately $240,000. To some people that might sound like a lot. To others, not so much. To me it sounded like my father's security, his savings, his independence, drawn down dollar by people eating dinner at his table. William said the investigators would be in touch. He said I should continue to behave normally. I said that was getting harder. He said, I know. Do it anyway." Over the next month, things were quiet on the surface. My daughter and her husband continued to reach out occasionally. Texts, mostly. Checking in. Being warm. Being completely normal in a way that felt like pressure. I went about my days. I went to the grocery store. I had coffee with a neighbor. I spent time in my father's house, which I'd been slowly sorting through. And I found myself noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before. The marks he'd made in the margins of his bank statements. The yellow legal pad in the kitchen drawer, with 2 years of notations in his handwriting. The way he'd filed everything, meticulously, in a system that turned out to be a record that told the whole story to anyone willing to read it carefully. He'd been preparing this. Not frantically, methodically, the way he did everything. The call came on a Thursday. It wasn't Detective Arnaud directly. It was his assistant, asking me to come in for a conversation at the Hamilton Police Service offices on King Street East. I went on Friday morning. Detective Arnaud was in his 40s, practical looking, the kind of man who doesn't waste sentences. He thanked me for coming, explained that the Financial Crimes Unit had been building a picture of the activity over the past several weeks, and that the documentation my father had left with William Chow, combined with the banking records they'd subpoenaed, was extremely thorough. "Your father was systematic," Detective Arnaud said. It sounded like a compliment. "He was a bookkeeper for 40 years, I said. He nodded. "It shows." He explained what they'd found. The power of attorney document that had been extended to include financial decisions bore my father's signature. But the witness signatures didn't match what the notary, on record, had in their files. The transfers to Pemberton Advisory had been routed deliberately through 2 intermediate accounts to obscure the trail. The numbered company had been registered in 2019, several months before my father's driving license was revoked, and the visits from my daughter and her husband had intensified. This hadn't been opportunistic. It had been planned. There were warrants in process, Arnaud told me. Search warrants for financial records and electronic devices. He asked me not to tell anyone. He asked if I thought I could continue acting normally for a little while longer. I thought about my daughter. I thought about the man who shook my hand at my own father's funeral and offered me a coffee in the parking lot and called it support. "Yes," I said, "I can do that." On the drive home, I stopped at a Tim Hortons and sat in the parking lot drinking a medium dark roast that I didn't really taste. A woman at the next table was helping her elderly mother read a menu. She was patient about it, pointing at each item, speaking clearly, not rushing. It was so ordinary and decent that I had to look away. 3 weeks later, my daughter was served at her home in Oakville. Her husband was served at the office of a client in Burlington. He was mid-presentation when the officers arrived. According to what I was told later, he asked if there had been some sort of administrative error. There had not been. I found out from Detective Arnaud, who called me that evening. He kept it brief. "It's happened," he said. "The warrants were executed this morning. I'll update you as things develop." I thanked him and put the phone down and sat in my father's kitchen for a long time. The radiator ticked. The calendar on the wall still had February appointments in it. Someone else's handwriting had started filling in March. That was what hit me, sitting there. Not the money, not the years of it, the calendar. The fact that someone else had been writing in his calendar. A few days later, my daughter's lawyer called. It was a short conversation. He expressed regret about the situation, suggested there may have been miscommunication around financial management, indicated his client was prepared to discuss restitution on a portion of the funds. He used the phrase, good faith resolution. I asked what portion. He was non-committal. Your father's mental acuity in his final years was documented by his physician, I said, at the notary's request, in October. Is there anything else? He said he'd be in touch. He wasn't. His client's husband's lawyer was. He took a slightly harder line. Consequences of a criminal trial, burden of proof, the interpretation of power of attorney documents, the nature of informal financial arrangements within families. He mentioned that my son-in-law had invested significant personal time in my father's care. I thought of my father writing withdrawals authorized and withdrawals not authorized in 2 columns in a yellow legal pad. I'll refer you to William Chow, I said. He handles the estate. The court process took the better part of a year. I won't pretend I followed every motion and filing. William kept me informed of what mattered. There were appearances and adjournments and negotiations that eventually went nowhere. My daughter entered a guilty plea 8 months in. Her husband went to trial and was convicted on 3 counts of fraud, over $5,000, and 1 count of breach of fiduciary duty. My daughter received a conditional sentence of 18 months, served in the community, with full restitution ordered. Her husband received 2 years less a day at a provincial institution, with restitution and a prohibition order, preventing him from acting in any fiduciary capacity for 10 years. I was not in the courtroom for the sentencing. I was in my father's backyard raking leaves. It seemed like the right place to be. William called me that afternoon. He read the sentences to me and asked if I had questions. I didn't. He said the estate would now proceed to final settlement. He said my father had been very clear about his intentions and very complete in his documentation. He made it easy, William said, to do the right thing. A month later, I went back to William's office one more time. He had a small package for me, kept separately from the estate files. My father had left it with instructions that it be given to me after everything was resolved. Inside was a pocket-sized notebook, the kind you can buy at a drugstore for $2. The cover was worn. Inside, in my father's handwriting, were 3 years of careful notes, dates, amounts, names, descriptions. Every transaction he suspected, every conversation that felt wrong, every time he'd asked a question and been told he was confused. At the back, he'd written 2 lines. If they win, none of this matters. If you're reading this, they didn't. I held the notebook for a long time. The office was quiet. William was at his desk, but not watching me, giving me the privacy of it. I'm not going to tell you the estate number. It's not relevant. What I'll tell you is that my father lived carefully, spent carefully, and left behind more than I expected. More than my daughter and her husband had managed to take, despite 3 years of trying. Some of what was recovered through restitution clawed back through the court process. Not all of it. Restitution orders and actual recovery are different things, and money that's been moved and spent and restructured doesn't always come back whole. But there was enough. I kept the house in the East End. I paid off the small mortgage I'd carried since Joan died. I made a donation in my father's name to a program at Hamilton Health Sciences that supports seniors navigating financial decision-making, teaching them what to watch for, what to ask, who to call. It felt like the right use of it. I had a conversation with my daughter eventually, not right away. 6 months after the sentencing, she came to Hamilton and we sat in a coffee shop on James Street, and she talked for a long time about pressure and choices and her husband's influence. Some of it I believed, some of it I didn't. All of it was true for her, I think, in the way that people's accounts of their own behavior are always at least a little true for them. I told her I wouldn't cut her off. I told her I also wouldn't pretend the last few years hadn't happened. We'd figure out what was left, if anything was left, slowly and carefully. She cried a little. I didn't. I'd done my grieving earlier, in private. Her husband I didn't speak to. That door felt closed in a way that wasn't worth testing. Some nights I still sit in my father's kitchen. I haven't sold the house. I don't know yet whether I will. There's something about the weight of it, the smell of it. The calendar, still on the wall, that I haven't been able to take down, that feels like it still has work to do. I think about the notebook, about a man in his late 70s sitting at a kitchen table, writing down what was being taken from him, column by column, date by date, knowing that no one around him believed what he was saying. He didn't rage about it. He didn't fold either. He just wrote it down. Waited. Trusted that if he was thorough enough, patient enough, the paperwork would outlast the story being told about him. He was right. I'm not someone who speaks easily about hard things. I worked in infrastructure for 3 decades. I care about whether pipes hold and systems function and maintenance schedules are met. I'm not the sort of man who usually finds himself with something he wants people to hear. But if you're older and someone close to you is handling your finances and something feels off, a number that doesn't look right, an explanation that doesn't quite add up, a question that gets answered with "don't worry about it," write it down. Keep records. Tell someone outside the house. Find your William Chow, whatever form that takes for you, and put something in his hands that will outlast whatever story someone else is building around you. My father couldn't protect himself in the end. But he protected the truth. He made it possible for the truth to survive him, and he trusted me to carry it the rest of the way. I've tried to be worthy of that.